They were the couple no one would have suspected of harboring dark secrets. He, a successful lawyer, she, a talented judge. But something went wrong. A story that began as a tale of love ended in a tragedy that no one could have predicted. It was an ordinary evening in Kanpur, and silence had enveloped the Circuit House colony. Yet, behind the walls of one of the apartments in the official housing, a secret was hidden that overturned the life of Pratibha Gautam, a judge who had moved to the area just a few months prior. Pratibha was known for her integrity and honesty, serving as a civil judge in the local court. Reserved yet determined, she had earned the trust of her colleagues and the respect of her neighbors. It seemed as though nothing could disrupt the steady rhythm of her life until one fateful evening changed everything. On the 8th of October 2016, her husband, Manu Rajan, a lawyer, set out on the long journey from Delhi to Kanpur. The couple had been married for less than a year, and although their love knew no bounds, their respective careers left an imprint on their relationship. Manu often stayed in Delhi, working at the Tis Hazari court, but he sought every opportunity to spend time with his wife. That evening behind the wheel, he mentally envisioned his meeting with Pratibha, looking forward to their weekend together. The journey was long, but being accustomed to such trips, Manu tried to maintain contact with his wife. He called her several times, but all his attempts went unanswered. At first, he assumed she was busy, perhaps immersed in her work or simply resting. But the closer he got to Kanpur, the more his anxiety grew. Why wasn't she answering? Why this silence? On the morning of the 9th of October, as the first rays of the sun began to illuminate the streets of Kanpur, Manu finally reached the Circuit House colony. Pulling up to the apartment, he dialed her number again, but the silence on the other end made him frown. He parked the car and hurried to the door. Barely catching his breath after the journey, he pressed the doorbell, listening intently, but a profound silence reigned within the apartment. He rang again and again, then began to knock, softly at first, then harder, until his worry turned into panic. The door was locked from the inside, which suggested that Pratibha had to be home. Manu realized that something was wrong, something serious. Time passed, but there was no answer. With a heavy heart, he made a decision that did not come easily: to break down the door. After several powerful blows, the lock gave way. The door swung open, and Manu, holding his breath, stepped inside. What he saw made him freeze. Hanging from the ceiling fan in the middle of the living room was his wife. Slashed wrists, dried blood, and a heavy scent in the air. Manu's world collapsed in that moment, and everything around him ceased to matter. He cautiously approached Pratibha, but her body hung lifelessly from the rope. When he touched her, Manu felt the rope slip, and the body slumped to the floor. Everything inside him tightened with horror and pain. He stood before her, unable to believe this was reality. Then, as if in a fog, he realized he had to act. He had to do something. Manu ran out of the apartment, ignoring the surprised glances of the neighbors. He got into his car and, tearing away from the spot, headed to the nearest police station, Kanpur Kant. Rushing inside, he told an officer in a trembling voice that his wife had likely taken her own life. The officer listened to him attentively without interruption and immediately gave the order to dispatch a team to the scene. It was from this moment that the investigation began, one that was meant to answer many questions. What happened to Pratibha? Why did the life of this strong woman end so tragically? The apartment in the Circuit House colony was shrouded in a somber silence when the officers burst inside. They were immediately alerted by the position of the body on the floor. As Manu had claimed, he found his wife hanging from the fan. He explained that, in a panic, he had taken her down, trying to help in any way he could, but this detail raised questions for the police. The bloodstains on the floor and furniture only intensified their suspicions. Senior officers and forensic experts soon arrived to begin recording evidence. They took photographs and collected physical clues. Throughout this time, Manu stayed nearby, his hands shaking and his face expressing a mixture of fear and horror. Outside, neighbors began to gather, whispering warily among themselves, wondering what could have happened in the judge's home. Pratibha Gautam was originally from the small town of Orai in Uttar Pradesh. From childhood, she showed an interest in the law, and after finishing school, she moved to Lucknow to enroll in university. There, she not only graduated successfully, but also decided to dedicate her life to jurisprudence. This choice led her to Delhi, where she enrolled in a master's program, hoping to one day become a judge. It was in Delhi that her life changed. There, she met Manu, a young and ambitious lawyer who, like her, strove for success. Manu came from an influential family. His father, a judge, had a distinguished career and worked in various prestigious organizations. The interaction between Pratibha and Manu began with simple conversations about their careers and the difficulties of exams. But it soon grew into something more. Shared meetings, long hours in libraries, and walks through the city followed. Their friendship blossomed into a romantic relationship, and they soon decided to get married. Nevertheless, not everything was smooth. When Pratibha announced her intention to marry Manu to her parents, their reaction was extremely negative. They wanted their daughter to marry someone of higher status and believed that Manu, being just a lawyer, was not a suitable match. Caste differences, a traditional system of social stratification in India, further complicated the situation. However, the young couple's love was stronger than social prejudices, and they decided to fight for their future together. In 2013, both decided to apply for the Judicial Services examination. Pratibha threw herself into her preparations, sitting over books for nights on end, attending special courses, and participating in practice tests. Her efforts paid off. She passed the competition and began her training. Manu, unfortunately, failed the exam. It was a heavy blow, but he decided not to give up and continued working as a lawyer, specializing in criminal cases. Despite the disappointment, their relationship remained strong. In 2015, Pratibha Gautam began her work as an additional civil judge in Kanpur. It was a responsible and difficult position that required total dedication, but she quickly proved she was ready for the challenges. Her hard work and fairness soon made her one of the most respected figures in the local court. During this time, Manu continued his legal career at the Tis Hazari Court in Delhi, where his persistence and professional skills earned him recognition and admiration from colleagues. On the 29th of January 2016, they made the bold decision to marry secretly at an Arya Samaj temple, a Hindu reform movement known for simplified marriage rites in Delhi. It was not a spontaneous decision, but rather a desperate attempt to take their destiny into their own hands. They knew that neither family would support their marriage, so they decided not to inform their relatives. The modest ceremony took place in the presence of only a few close friends who helped organize the rite. Shortly thereafter, they registered their marriage officially, and all of this in secret from their families. After the wedding, they tried to mend relations with their families. On Manu's side, changes occurred over time. His parents accepted Pratibha, began to recognize her as their daughter-in-law, and even showed involvement in her life. However, Pratibha's family remained adamant. Her parents could not forgive her choice, believing that Manu did not fit their daughter's status and background. On the 23rd of April, 2 months after the wedding, Pratibha and Manu decided to organize a formal reception in Delhi to announce their marriage. It was a bright celebration filled with joy and merriment, but the absence of Pratibha's parents cast a shadow over the general mood. Her parents only found out about the wedding after everything had already happened, and despite all of Pratibha's attempts to reconcile with them, they remained distant. She hoped that their opinion would change with time, but so far, that had not happened. Eventually, Manu and Pratibha decided to move to Kanpur. Pratibha received government housing in the prestigious Circuit House colony. This place became their new home, quiet and safe, allowing them to partially escape family problems and focus on their careers. For several months, Manu stayed in Kanpur, but he then returned to Delhi to continue his work. Their marriage had lasted for half a year. Despite all the difficulties of separation, family conflicts, and tension, they continued to support each other, maintained constant contact, and met often. Pratibha and Manu found joy in every moment they shared. They made plans, dreamed of the future, and believed their love would overcome any obstacles. On the morning of the 9th of October, Manu arrived in Kanpur to see Pratibha, only to find his wife dead in the apartment. Police officer Rupa arrived quite quickly, especially considering Pratibha's status. She was a judge. Her death was not just a tragedy, but a challenge to the entire system. Officers began to carefully inspect the apartment, recording all possible evidence. The scarf that had been tied around Pratibha's neck was still near her body. The cuts on her hands raised many questions for the investigators. What had happened in this room? And why did everything look so strange? Manu, trembling with horror and grief, gave his initial statements, recounting how he found Pratibha. He claimed that when he entered, she was hanging and that he took her down, but the body fell to the floor. The police ordered a forensic medical examination to establish the exact cause and time of death, but even at first glance, everything looked highly suspicious. Cuts on the wrists and hanging. 2 independent attempts to take one's own life seemed unlikely. Investigators noted details that did not align with typical cases. The cuts on the neck were deep, there were 3 of them, and they were arranged in a single line, which suggested an application of force. The scarf left a mark in the shape of the letter O. This was another strange point. In a typical hanging, the mark on the neck usually has a V or U shape, but a circular mark could indicate strangulation while the person was in a horizontal position. Investigators began to suspect that someone might have tried to stage a scene to make it look as though Pratibha had committed suicide. Pratibha's hands also spoke volumes: 14 deep cuts, 6 on the right hand, and 8 on the left. The cuts were neat and parallel, as if they had been inflicted purposefully and without haste. None of this fit the usual pattern, and the police had enough reasons to doubt the simplicity of what had occurred. The news of the tragedy spread quickly. Pratibha's father, upon learning of her death, was in complete shock. Along with his wife, he immediately left for Kanpur, overwhelmed by grief and a lack of understanding of what could have happened to their daughter. Pratibha's body was sent for an autopsy at a local hospital, but there, everything went wrong. Transporting a judge's body in a makeshift vehicle caused a wave of criticism among colleagues and citizens. When the body arrived at the hospital, it was left in a corner of the corridor until the autopsy began. This sparked condemnation and many questions for the police. The autopsy was conducted late at night, and experts began their work, trying to piece together all the details of this tangled and tragic story. Manu always confidently recounted how he found his wife in that terrible state. But when the forensic team arrived at the crime scene, it was immediately clear that the picture did not add up. The fan he spoke of was the focus of attention. He claimed Pratibha hung from it, but bloodstains on the fan blades only raised more questions than answers. They looked elongated, as if her hands had merely brushed the blades, but there were no characteristic droplets usually found in violent acts. Everything looked too clean, too neat. The fan rod also did not inspire confidence. It was clearly not strong enough to support the weight of an adult. In a real attempt at hanging, it should have at least been deformed, but nothing of the sort was found. Investigators realized that something was amiss. The apartment door, according to Manu, had been broken into. He insisted he had to kick it in to gain entry, but investigators quickly noticed that the lock was only slightly damaged and functioned properly. The door closed and opened without issue, which did not correspond at all to the story of a break-in. If it had been kicked in, it would not have functioned so easily. This fact intensified the suspicion toward Manu. Something in his version of events clearly did not match reality. When the police began the interrogation, the senior officer tried to clarify every detail. Manu described his trip to Delhi in great detail. Every stage, every detail of his journey was prepared in advance. Toll road receipts, CCTV footage, call history. He even claimed he called Pratibha several times along the way. This abundance of information which he provided without much questioning looked suspicious, as if he knew what questions he would be asked and was ready to answer them. Manu repeatedly asked to be released, claiming he had done everything he could to help the investigation, but the police continued to insist on his presence for further questioning and clarification. As an experienced lawyer, he understood perfectly well that there could be many details at a crime scene that could play a decisive role, and his knowledge of all these details made his story too smooth, too well thought out. But the real questions arose when investigators learned that Manu did not call the police immediately after discovering the body. Instead, he got into his car and drove to a station that was 2 to 3 kilometers from the apartment. In a similar situation, most people immediately dialed the emergency services number, but not Manu. He explained this by saying he was in shock and confused, that he didn't know the right way to act. He claimed he tried to find help twice, but in the end, it turned out he only went to the station once. These inconsistencies, strange details, and discrepancies in his story made investigators believe they were dealing with something much more complex than it seemed at first glance. Manu, despite all his confident answers, was beginning to look to them like a man who had too many answers for every question. And yet, the truth about what happened on that fateful day remained a mystery. Investigators understood that the solution was still ahead and that Manu might be the key to unraveling the secret. Everything that happened in this colony was always under the vigilant watch of security. High-ranking government officials and bureaucrats lived here. The territory was guarded and security posts stood at the entrance. But Manu, upon discovering that the apartment door wouldn't open, did not turn to the guards for help. Why? This question immediately caught the investigators' attention, as any other person in such a situation would likely seek support from those nearby. This lack of an attempt to call for help looked suspicious, as did many other moments in his behavior. Manu said that after discovering the body, he went to the police station. But here is what is strange. He did not inform the guards about what happened when he left the colony. He could have turned to them, and that would likely have expedited the police call, but he simply got into his car and left. The police noted this as another oddity that caused them to doubt his sincerity. When Pratibha's parents arrived at the scene, they were deeply shaken by what they saw. Grief turned to anger. They openly accused Manu and his relatives of their daughter's death. They said Manu restricted her communication with her family, constantly pressured her, and created unbearable living conditions. Pratibha's father filed a police report, demanding that a case be opened against Manu under articles related to murder and abetting suicide. He stated that either Manu was directly involved in her death or his behavior drove Pratibha to it. Pratibha was a successful and independent woman, a judge accustomed to living on her own. She had been supporting herself for 6 years. Her relatives could not believe the version that Pratibha had harmed herself. They recalled that she never showed signs of depression or ill intentions. This made them wonder what could have pushed her to such a step. On the night of the 9th of October, an autopsy was performed involving 4 experienced doctors. The findings of the forensic medical examination were shocking. The cause of death was strangulation. This indicated a violent nature of events. Marks of blows were found on Pratibha's body, as if she had been hit with a metal object. 14 cuts were counted on her hands and wrists, and 3 deep cuts from sharp objects were on her neck. Everything pointed specifically to a struggle, to an attempt to resist before death. But the most unexpected discovery was yet to come. Pratibha turned out to be 3.5 months pregnant. This detail raised new questions for the investigation. How could a woman expecting a child and working in a responsible position take her own life? Even if one were to assume she inflicted the cuts on herself and strangled herself, the signs of the beating remained unexplained. Why were there so many injuries on her body? During further interrogations, Manu began to get nervous. His confident answers were replaced by uncertainty. He got confused in his testimony and hesitated, and this did not escape the attention of the investigators. All of this looked like clear signs that he was hiding something. Ultimately, he was taken into custody for further investigation. The police understood that the case required a special approach. Manu was a lawyer, his father was a retired judge, and his brother-in-law held an important position in the judicial system. Any mistake could lead to serious consequences. When Manu appeared before the court to determine a restrictive measure, public pressure and his family's status played a role. Instead of a standard term in custody, the judge limited the detention time to only 7 hours. This decision caused disapproval from both investigators and Pratibha's relatives. They believed Manu was given too lenient conditions considering the seriousness of the charges. After the autopsy was completed, Pratibha's body was handed over to her family. Her relatives, including her parents, brothers, and sisters, were grief-stricken. They remembered how in recent months Pratibha had called home and sounded depressed. She did not share details and avoided talking about her personal life. Now all these little things began to seem like signs they perhaps had not noticed in time. With each passing day, the tragedy seemed more tangled, and the answers to all the questions were still far off. The police seized Manu's phone and began a thorough analysis of all messages, calls, and letters. It became known that in recent months, tense arguments had been occurring more frequently in their relationship. They quarreled about the future child, about family plans, and almost every message from Manu was filled with irritation. All of this only intensified suspicion, but at that time, no one could have imagined how deep these dark roots reached. Manu was in the crosshairs of the investigators. Interrogations lasted for hours. Pressure grew, and every new question from the investigators and every piece of evidence seemed to weigh on him even more. One day, in a state of extreme exhaustion and internal breakdown, Manu broke and spoke words that changed everything. He confessed. The words sounded as if they were tearing from the depths of his soul, painfully and reluctantly. The confession to Pratibha's murder sounded unexpected and horrifying. Manu recounted that jealousy and resentment had built up inside him for years, seizing his mind and emotions. It all began at the moment when Pratibha received the position of judge, while he remained an ordinary lawyer. This gap in status became a source of deep internal suffering for him. He could not come to terms with the fact that his wife had achieved more, that her family openly showed their disrespect for him. With each day, this feeling grew into an obsession. The news of the pregnancy was, for Pratibha, a symbol of their love and hope for the future. She thought the child would strengthen their marriage and help mend relations with her parents. Pratibha's mother was happy and planned to support her daughter, even to meet her to discuss their future. No, for Manu, this news was another blow. Instead of joy, he felt only fear and even greater alienation. In his head, pregnancy meant a restriction of freedom, even more responsibilities, and a deepening of the gap that already existed between him and his wife. Friends knew Manu as a person who preferred a carefree lifestyle. Parties, freedom, a lack of responsibility, all of this was part of his character. And now, the prospect of becoming a father loomed over him, which terrified him to his core. He began to insist on an abortion, but Pratibha categorically refused. Her firm desire to keep the child only exacerbated the conflict. Her attempts to show him that a happy future awaited them caused him new fits of irritation. He felt cornered. Everything only got worse. Manu began to control Pratibha's life even more intensely. He did not let her communicate with her parents and was jealous of her work and her successes. Pratibha was successful at work, but at home her world was filled with fear and control. In early October, Pratibha's mother wanted to see her daughter, and this became the final breaking point. Manu lost his temper. He could not bear that Pratibha had disobeyed him and contacted her relatives. He demanded she stop all communication, but she was steadfast. His wife declared that she would protect her rights, that she would keep the child, and that she would not give up. These words were the last straw for Manu. His jealousy, his sense of failure, his fear of losing control, all of this mixed together in one moment. He could no longer endure her strength, her independence. The situation exploded on that fateful day. And now, sitting across from the investigators, he spoke of his fears, about how jealousy was choking him, that he simply could not bear her success and the fact that she did not need him the way he wanted. But even after his confession, investigators realized that something remained behind the scenes. Perhaps he had only told part of the truth, and the dark secrets of their relationship were yet to be revealed. Events unfolded rapidly and unpredictably, starting from the moment when Pratibha announced to Manu that she would go to Delhi, despite his categorical objections. This was on the 7th of October. At that moment, Manu was vacationing with friends at a resort, but this news threw him off balance. He immediately decided to return to Delhi. He abandoned his vacation, left his friends, and headed home. On the 8th of October, Pratibha arrived in Delhi by train. She hoped that a personal conversation could change something in their relationship, but she was met by a Manu full of irritation and anger. He put his wife in the car, and already on the road, an argument began between them. The atmosphere heated up. Words turned into shouts. At some point, Pratibha simply could not take it anymore. She got out of the car in the middle of the road, stating she was returning to Kanpur, and walked away. Manu watched her, his eyes burning with rage. "Do whatever you want," he spat at her back. But after some time, his emotions took over and he decided to go after her. Manu reached Kanpur throughout the night. It took him approximately 9 hours to reach the apartment in Pratibha's prestigious Circuit House colony. It was early on the morning of the 9th of October, around 5 or 5:30 in the morning. The colony was famous for its security, and most neighbors did not interfere in other people's business, which gave him a certain freedom of action. Manu broke into the apartment, and all the tension of the last months burst out. He began to beat Pratibha, using a stick. He did not stop even when she tried to resist. When the blows with the stick did not satisfy his anger, he pulled out a blade and began to inflict cuts on her hands, body, and neck. Pratibha tried with all her might to fight back, but she soon lost consciousness, falling to the floor. Manu realized she was still alive, and this forced him to act further. He grabbed a scarf and wrapped it around Pratibha's neck, tightening it hard. A few minutes later, her life ended. Manu stood there, breathing heavily, realizing what he had just done. Now he needed to figure out how to hide his actions. He tried to present everything as if his wife had taken her own life by hanging Pratibha's body from the fan. No, the fan turned out to be too fragile. It wouldn't support the weight and threatened to collapse. Realizing his plan wouldn't work, Manu hurriedly left the body on the floor. He quickly checked the apartment for any evidence that could give him away and took Pratibha's phone. He understood that her phone could become proof of his motives and intentions. Around 6 in the morning, he left the apartment and headed to his car. He tried to behave calmly so as not to attract attention and left the Circuit House area, but he did not go straight to the police. Manu stopped on one of the quiet streets of Kanpur to compose himself and think about what to tell the police. He realized that every detail would be important. Only after 3 hours, at approximately 9 in the morning, did he head to the police station. There, he reported his wife's death, claiming he found her already dead in the apartment. The police immediately noticed the oddities in his behavior. Why had he taken so long to report what happened? Why, instead of immediately calling for help, did he spend time reflecting? These questions gave the investigators no peace. After his initial testimony, Manu was detained for further interrogation. During this time, the police began a detailed inspection of the crime scene. They found the scarf with which Pratibha had been strangled, but the blade with which the wounds were inflicted was missing. This only intensified the suspicion. Manu had clearly tried to get rid of the murder weapon and confused the investigation. Now the police realized that a difficult investigation lay ahead to get to the truth. On the eve of the crime, he had sent Pratibha's housekeeper and driver on vacation. At the time, it seemed like a simple coincidence, but later it became clear that this step was part of his plan. When Manu was detained, his parents quickly went into hiding, avoiding all police summons. The court did not let this go unnoticed and issued a warrant for their arrest, as well as a decree to confiscate their property until they appeared for questioning. Manu's parents tried to save their position by appealing to the Supreme Court. They managed to obtain a temporary stay of the warrant's execution, but the court ruled that they must voluntarily surrender at the Kanpur court. On the 18th of October, Manu's parents finally appeared at the Chief Magistrate's Court to participate in the proceedings. Meanwhile, Manu made desperate attempts to be released on bail. He filed petitions in various judicial instances, the Sessions Court, the High Court, and even the Supreme Court. But everywhere, he was met with a refusal. The seriousness of the charges and the risk to the further investigation made his release impossible. Years passed, and by 2022, Manu had already spent about 5 years in prison. The legal battle continued, and in April 2022, the High Court, after many appeals and counterclaims, decided to grant him release on bail. No, this was only a temporary measure. The case was still at the stage of consideration, and a final verdict had not yet been delivered. The police and prosecution continued their work, trying to prove Manu's guilt, while his family, despite all efforts, continued to fight for his acquittal. The final sentence has not yet been pronounced. The case is still under review. The police and prosecution are continuing their work, and Manu's defense is still fighting for an acquittal. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to my channel. Many more shocking stories await you ahead.